Okay there, hi Yerds. Welcome to your second lesson about typography, Miss W's favorite topic when it comes to graphic design, and yearbook for the most part. I love type. I love anything design, really. So Typography 102. So we're going to be taking what we learned about the 4 types of type, and we're going to be adding on to it. So today for your homework, just take notes please, and I'll be checking your notes for tomorrow in class. Again, we're going to be using this knowledge more as we progress on through yearbook, but I just want to make sure that you're listening to the information, that you're processing it by writing down your notes. And so that's why I'll be checking them rather than me do this during class and make sure I have your attention and that sort of thing. So Typography 102. All right, so when we talk about alignment as far as design, we also have to think about alignment of text. And there's 4 different types of alignment of text. The first is align left. The next is align right. Then we have center. And then we have the rarely justified. Aha, type jokes. All right, so align left, this is when we set the type flush left, so they align with the left-hand margin of the type. When we do this, the type is the most readable and natural because we read from left to right. It also keeps the spacing in between words consistent, so it makes it easy for the readers to read. However, what this does is it creates a jagged edge to the type on the right hand side, which can be an issue depending on where the type is placed. So we do most often align left in design. However, there is also the opposite, which is aligning right. So again, this creates an aligned text, but this time it's flipped to the right-hand side. So what this does is it creates a jagged edge to the start of the line of the text. It drops down the readability slightly, just because your reader starts here and then they have to come in here and then they go back out there. You know, it kind of flip-flops them, moves them over a little bit. Next, we have centered. So centered is more balanced and formal because it's centered kind of like on a pendulum. It's equally weighted on both sides. It's best used for small amounts of text. We don't want to do a centered amount of text for a large full feature story or a body copy. It works really well for quotes, maybe a caption if it's a short caption, not your extended captions. Your extended captions, you really want to focus on using them align left or align right due to the readability. It also is tiring after a time when you're reading with centered type, and that's again why we only use it for a short amount of text. Centered type is also really good for headlines, things like that. Next, we have the rarely used justified type. I hate justified type. It looks really nice for the fact that both right and left side are aligned, so it makes this beautiful linear column of text. However, what you'll notice is the uneven spacing in between the words. It's especially difficult to read, and so if we need to do justified text, it's very, very little amount of text because it is kind of hard to read. Also, you should do it in narrower columns. Can't say that word. So again, if you're going to make justified text, make sure your columns are pretty darn narrow. Don't do a big old thick wide column and then justify it. That will just be unjustified. All right. So next we need to talk about the spacing, which we call, when you space in between lines of type, that's called leading. So sometimes what you'll hear graphic designers say is that you need to adjust the leading in between your type. So what they're referring to is the spacing in between what we call the baseline of the text. So the baseline is where all of the letters sit. It is like the ground that all the letters rest on. That's called the baseline. So leading is the measurement, the spacing in between layers of baseline. So here you can see the quick fox jumped. They're talking about leading, measurement from the bottom of each one of the text word rest. So if I say that you need to put in more leading for your type, it means you need to kind of give it some more air, give it some more space. If you don't have enough leading, everything looks really squished and compact, and it's hard to read. So you want to give it some air so your eye gets a little bit of visual break in between lines of text. So here we have some common terms that we're going to use when we're describing type. The first that we're going to talk about is point size. You probably have adjusted the point size of your text and not really realized it. Most times your English teacher will talk about making your essay 12-point font. So they're talking about the point size of the font. So point size is the measurement for the typography from the lowest point, the descender, up to the highest point, which is the ascender. So here we see the point size. It's kind of an imaginary line from the bottom of the descender. So here we see the descender is the Y. That's the little stroke that dips below the baseline that all the letters are on. Anything that goes below the baseline is considered a descender. So you have descenders for G's, for Y's, for P's. You know, you get the idea. Anything that goes below. That's a descender. So you measure from the bottom of the descender to the top of the ascender. An ascender is anything that goes above the X height, and the X height is the top of the letters. Okay? So we went over what is a serif last Typography 101. We talked about sans serif, serif, and script and decorative fonts. So just a refresher, a serif are the tiny marks, the little feet at the end of the letter of the stroke, little tails as I refer to them, but they're actually called feet. And your serifs can look a little bit different depending on the font. But anyways, those are the little feet that come off to your letters. So next we'll talk about ascender. So an ascender is any stroke that rises above the X height. The X height is the general lowercase letters where they intersect kind of a midpoint line. It's in the middle of the lines, the body of the letter. They refer to that as the X height. You may remember doing X heights when you were having to first draw your letters. You had to go up to that midpoint line. You had the top line, the bottom line, and that midpoint line. That midpoint line was referencing the X height, so you had to make your A's go all the way up to that midpoint line and then do your little ascender above the top. And then you had to take your G's, the bowl of the G lived between the baseline and the X height, and then the bottom swoosh, the hook of the G came down to the bottom where your descender should live. So you played around with fonts before when you were learning how to write. You just didn't know it. So again, an ascender goes above the X height. The X height is the body of the lowercase letter where the tops of them are. So the top is referred to as the X height. The bottom rests on the baseline. So that's, again, that invisible line that all your letters rest on. So the last point about type. Aha, this is going to be a pun. Type is measured in points, which is done from the top of the ascender to where the bottom of the descenders live. So the very top to the very bottom is how we, that range is how we figure out what point it is. Weird factoid, there are 72 points per inch. So if you have a 72-point font, it is 1 inch high when you actually print it out. From the top of the ascender to the bottom of the descender. That being said, if we divide that by 2, 36-point font is ½ inch tall from the ascender to the descender. So there's some math for you in with graphic design, again, cross-curricular. However, what you need to know is just because a font is 36 point in one font and it's 36 point in another font doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the same size. And that's because fonts have different X heights. So while it may measure the same from the top of the ascender to the descender, the general font will feel and look a different size because of the X height. And so I'm going to illustrate that in my next slide. So here we have Times New Roman, very popular font, and we have Arial, another popular font. Times New Roman is a serif font. Arial is a sans serif font. These are both shown in 10-point size. So you can see here that the ascenders and descenders are relatively the same size. The top of the fonts are relatively aligned. However, when we look at EAR and OO, and EAR and OO, the Arial font appears a lot larger than the Times New Roman. And that's because Arial, the X height, is higher than the Times New Roman. That can be illustrated. Here we have the 18-point size for wide Latin. Here we have Archer semi-bold. So again, you can see these are both considered 18-point font, but the wide Latin appears so much larger than the Archer semi-bold. Here we look at a 60-point font size and then a 60-point font size. Notice that the impact has a lot more impact than the I can't say that. The script font to the left. You can see that this one, the X height is so much lower than the impact. So when we're thinking about font sizes, we really need to test out our fonts and do a 100% printout to make sure that when our readers read our book, that our 8-point font of a certain font is not, 8-point size font of a certain font is not too small for them to read compared to last year's font that was 8-point. We just assume that 8-point is 8-point, but really there's a big difference between font families. Alright, so one more thing that we need to think about when we're playing around with font is how we use font sizes in relation to column width. So what you need to remember is the larger your column is, the wider it is, the larger your type needs to be. In contrast, the smaller, the more narrow your column is, the smaller your type needs to be. And that's because if we have large type and narrow little columns, it's going to feel very congested and too full and too compact. And the same can be said for a wide column. If you have a wide column, it's got this itty bitty type, it's really exhausting to read all the way across. And so we need to kind of keep it balanced as far as the size of the font to the size of the column. It's very important that we consider those. They should be proportional, okay? So, yearbookers, you should have notes about Typography 102 for class tomorrow. Hopefully you've gained some knowledge about type as far as sizing, some of the terms when we're describing type, and things that we need to watch out for as far as X height and column sizes. Okay guys, hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in for Typography 102.